Greetings, chess players! My name is Chris Torres, and this is Daily Chess Musings' special coverage of the 2021 FIDE World Championship Match between Magnus Carlsen and Carlsen-Nepomniachtchi. Game 6 was the first decisive game of the 2021 World Championship, and today's episode is part 2 of 3 for this truly historic game. As you recall, Part 1 of this series concluded with Magnus Carlsen and Carlsen-Nepomniachtchi reaching the first time control after a fierce skirmish under extreme time pressure. My second installment begins after move 40 was reached, when both players were awarded another hour of time. This gave Magnus Carlsen and Carlsen-Nepomniachtchi enough breathing room to put on a strategic masterclass in 2 rooks versus a queen imbalance. However, after playing 30 more moves in this epic battle, both players found themselves back in time trouble before transitioning into a rook and knight versus queen endgame on move 82. This is where we conclude part 2, and we will examine the ensuing endgame in our next episode. Now that I have defined the episodes in the series, let's take a close look at part 2 of 3 from Game 6 of the Carlsen-Nepomniachtchi match.
Magnus starts the second time control with 41 rook a to c2. Then 41 bishop f8. No longer pinned, Jan's bishop was free to move away from the close quarter combat, and from f8 will support black's pawn moving from a4 to a3. Carlsen plays 42 knight c5, threatening the queen. Jan plays 42 queen b5, 43 knight to d3, and then a3. Jan's passed pawn is now just 2 squares away from glory. 44 knight f4. But all of black's pawns require defending, and Carlsen plays knight f4, targeting the weak h5 pawn. 44 queen a5. But for the moment, black's queen can step behind her passed pawn while defending h5. 45 rook a2, and then bishop b4. 46 rook d3. Carlsen moves his rook to a safe square while threatening a3 a second time. 46 king h6. Jan moves his king to h6 so that his queen is not overworked. In other words, now black's king is defending the h5 pawn so that the queen can devote all her energy to defending the a3 pawn. 47 rook to d1. Carlsen drops his rook back to the first rank en route to forming a battery in the a file. 47 queen a4. With h5 defended by his king, Jan advances the queen 1 square, threatening Carlsen's rook. 48 rook d to a1. Carlsen has his rooks ideally placed. Now he just needs to reposition his knight in order to overwhelm black's defenses on the a3 pawn. 48 bishop d6. Pinning the knight with the threat of another pin. Now if Carlsen's knight attempts to team up with the rooks via knight d3 or knight d5 or even knight e2, black's queen can simply play queen takes h4 check because the pawn on g3 would be pinned to white's king and therefore unable to recapture on h4. 49 king g1. Carlsen sees the trouble and moves his king to a safer square. To which Jan responds with 49 queen b3. 50 knight to e2. Now white's knight is just 2 steps away from adding a third attacker to the a3 pawn. 50 queen d3. Guarding f5 in preparation for Magnus playing knight to d4, so that there is no threat of a knight fork. 51 knight d4. Magnus's knight is getting closer to that pawn on a3. 51 king h7. 52 king h2. Magnus did not play knight c2 immediately, but it would have been interesting. Let's take a look. If white had played 52 knight c2. Then black could reply with bishop e5, threatening the rook on a1. White could ignore that threat for the moment with knight takes a3. Then bishop takes a1, rook takes a1. Then queen c3 would be a fork. 55 rook f1, saving the rook. Queen takes a3. Here black may have a queen versus a rook in an endgame, but white has a nifty way of creating an impenetrable fortress in just 3 steps. 56 rook d1 is step 1. f5, black cannot stop the process that white has initiated. 57 rook d4 is step 2. Then king g7. And finally, 58 rook f4, step 3. We have a draw, as white's only weak target is f2, but that is defended by the rook on f4, and the rook on f4 is in turn defended by the pawns on e3 and g3. g3 also defends h4, and so does the rook. Simply put, black would need at least 2 attackers to target f2, but Jan would only have his queen. Black's king cannot advance past the 4th rank, and black's pawns are unable to threaten white's rook or any of white's pawns and or the king. In chess, this kind of structure is known as a fortress. White is down a significant amount of material, but has an impenetrable defense. But back to our feature game. Magnus played 52 king h2, and then 52 queen e4. Jan abandons his pawn on a3. Jan abandons his pawn on a3 in favor of the queen h4 threat. 53 rook takes a3. Magnus gladly takes on a3, as with all the pawns now on one side of the board, his rooks can start doubling up on black's pawn weaknesses. 53 queen takes h4 check, 54 king g1, and then 54 queen e4. 55 rook a4. Magnus places his rook onto the same rank as his opponent's queen. 55 bishop e5. So Jan places a pseudo pin with his bishop on white's knight. 56 knight e2. A pseudo pin because when the pin knight moves, it opens a discovered attack on black's queen. 56 queen c2. So Jan moves his queen to c2, threatening the knight, while his bishop is still eyeing the rook on a1. 57 rook 1 to a2. Magnus calmly moves his rook to the 2nd rank, threatening Jan's queen while defending his knight. Jan plays queen b3 instead of queen to b1 because on b3 his queen has immediate access to d6, e6, and b7. 58 king g2. Magnus invites the check from queen d5. 58 queen d5. Jan obliges with a check. 59 f3. f3 of course blocks the check, but creates some long-term vulnerabilities. Magnus is definitely playing for a win. 59 queen d1. 60 f4. Carlsen is forcing his opponent's bishop to leave its pawn defender, thus creating another potential target. Plus, moving the pawn to f4 opens an opportunity for the knight to use f3 for maneuvering. 60 bishop c7. Again, both players were getting low on time, but now that move 60 has been reached, they will both get an additional 15 minutes added to their clock, plus 30 seconds for every move. 61 king f2, and 61 bishop b6. Jan circles the bishop around to target the weak e3 pawn, which also prevents the e3 pawn from advancing because of a pin to the king. 62 rook a1, threatening the queen. 62 queen b3, and Jan doubles up on e3. 63 rook e4. Carlsen adds the much-needed defender to e3 while preparing for rook to e8, followed by rook to a8. This maneuver will coordinate the rooks into an attacking formation against black's king. 63, king g7. Jan sees the potential trouble and moves his king off the edge. 64, rook e8. And 64, f5. Jan's creating the f6 escape hatch for his king. 65, rook a to a8. And 65, queen b4. Nepo is preparing his own battery with queen b4 and then bishop a5, which will threaten queen e1 check. Alternatively, Jan could have played 65, queen d3, which could lead to a draw after 66, rook g8 check, king f6, rook a to e8, h4, gx h4, bishop takes e3 check, rook takes e3, queen takes e2 check, and 70, rook takes e2, is a really cool stalemating idea. Just look at it. Black's king has nowhere to move, and his two remaining pawns are stuck in place. So some fun food for thought. But in our feature game, Nepo played 65, queen b4. 66, rook a to c8. So Carlsen moves his rook from a8 to c8 so that it will have a path to come back to the first rank after black plays bishop a5. 66, bishop a5. Nepo is threatening queen e1 check. 67, rook c1, defending e1, but leaving the rook on e8 undefended. 67, bishop b6. The bishop returns to threatening the weak e3 pawn and also pinning that weak pawn to white's king. 68, rook e5. Carlsen finds support for the e-rook while threatening rook takes f5. 68, queen b3. Jan lets Magnus know that if he captures f5, he will regret it after queen takes e3 check, and also sets a devious trap. 69, rook e8. A trap which Magnus avoids. What was the trap? Let me show you. Had Magnus played 69, rook h1, which seems like a tempting way to start an attack, Jan would have played 69, f6, which is big trouble since white's e5 rook must stay in the e-file to defend the e-pawn from queen takes e3 check. So 70, rook e7 check keeps the rook in the e-file, but then black's king can go to f8. Now where is the safe square for which the rook can keep defending e3 from? There isn't one. So the best white could do there is probably rook e1, then king takes the rook. Knight goes to g1. White's lost the rook and would lose the game, which is why Magnus Carlsen played 69, rook to e8, and not 69, rook h1. 69, queen d5. Nepo centralizes his queen. 70, rook c to c8, and Carlsen connects his rooks again in the 8th rank. 70, queen h1. Nepo moves his queen to h1, creating what I refer to as the power formation between the queen and king. A knight's move is one piece a queen cannot copy, of course, but good things tend to happen when a queen has her opponent's king a knight move away. Plus, at some point, Nepo may consider playing h4 when the exchange of pawns would leave white's king very exposed. 71, rook c1. Carlsen doesn't want to test this theory of the power formation, so he quickly shoos the black queen away. 71, queen d5. 72, rook b1. Carlsen threatens Nepo's bishop while still guarding h1. 72, bishop a7. Not the best choice for black, but both players were staying above 5 minutes on their clock by using the 30-second increment. A better choice here for Nepo would have been 72, bishop c7, which gives the bishop more options and white no advantage. The pieces can continue to circle around each other, with play perhaps continuing, with rook g1, queen d7, rook a8, queen d5, rook a4, queen b3, rook a8, bishop b6, rook e8, queen d3. But with careful play, neither side will make any progress. But in our feature game, Nepo chose the slightly inaccurate 72 bishop a7, which is a less flexible square for the dark bishop to be on than c7. 73 rook e7, bishop c5. 74 rook e5, skewering the queen to the bishop. And then 74 queen d3. Jan's queen threatens e3 and b1. And now Magnus was under 2 minutes on his clock. 75 rook b7, saving the rook and pinning the f7 pawn to black's king. 75 queen c2, then 76 rook b5. Magnus coordinates both of his rooks on the 5th rank, which has plenty of targets. However, he is down to 30 seconds on his clock. 76 bishop a7, 77 rook a5, 77 bishop b6, 78 rook a to b5. But with a 30-second increment, Carlsen is wise to repeat some moves. As long as he doesn't repeat a position 3 times, he can use this technique to earn some time back on his clock. 78 bishop a7, 79 rook takes f5. The first of black's isolated 5th rank pawns falls. 79 queen d3. Jan returns to threatening queen takes e3. 80 rook takes f7 check. This is a key moment in the game. Very low on time and under tremendous pressure on the board, Magnus Carlsen simplifies in a complicated manner, as simply adding an extra defender to the e3 pawn would have been less accurate. For example, had Magnus played 80 rook fe5, then bishop takes e3, drops a pawn, rook takes e3, and queen takes b5 would leave black with a small advantage, which is why Magnus Carlsen played 80 rook f7 check. Nepo needs to take with 80 king takes f7, then rook b7 check, 81 king g6, 82 rook takes a7, and unlike the variation we just looked at, white maintains his e3 pawn, and thus white has a small advantage in a tricky rook and knight plus 3 pawns ending versus a queen and pawn.
I hope you enjoyed today's special presentation of Part 2 of Game 6 from the 2021 FIDE World Championship Match between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. For more on the match, please visit the official website at FIDEWorldChampionship.com. Additionally, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my Daily Chess Musings YouTube channel. Finally, be sure to check out dailychessmusings.com to find my notes to this video, as well as thousands of other free learning resources. My name is Chris Torres, and I will see you next time with a special presentation of Part 3 of Game 6 from the Carlsen-Nepomniachtchi match.